Thank you all for joining us here at CSIS. I'm Michael Green. I want to thank you for coming on behalf of our president, John Hamre, who will be joining us shortly. We are very honored today to host Dr. Akihiko Tanaka, the president of JICA, the Japan International Cooperation Agency. Aki Tanaka is a longtime friend to many here. He is a distinguished scholar with a PhD from the Massachusetts Institute for Technology, and was a professor of international relations, a dean and a vice president at Tokyo University, and chairman of the U.S.-Japan Institute, which is co-hosting this with us, a consortium think tank of 10 leading universities in Japan. And this year, Dr. Tanaka was appointed the president of JICA. This is his first trip to the United States in that role, and he brings all of his broad strategic thinking as a scholar of international relations with practical experience and an excellent track record and staff at JICA. So I'll shortly invite Dr. Tanaka to take the stage, and he'll make some opening remarks. I'm then going to take one of these comfy chairs and engage in a brief dialogue, and then we'll open it up for questions from all of you. But first, join me in welcoming Dr. Akihiko Tanaka, the president of JICA.
Well, thank you, Mike. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great honor to be here today at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. As a long-time student of international politics and U.S.-Japan relations, I owe a great deal to CSIS. I always learn a great deal at CSIS with its variety of sharp ideas and thinking that are relevant to the reality of the world. Learning reality is important to an academic, especially when the reality that one learns is one's subject matter. But now, as was introduced, I'm working at one of the most important global and public-oriented institutions in Japan. It is crucial to learn reality, and it is my duty to learn reality. Therefore, it is a great privilege to have this opportunity here to learn reality in my areas of work. Prospects for U.S.-Japan cooperation in development. However, like many other Japanese who have had the opportunity to talk with you in the US since March last year, I cannot talk about US-Japan cooperation without first expressing my sincere gratitude to all the American people for their sympathy and support after the great East Japan earthquake. Last spring, my students and staff at the University of Tokyo organized a volunteer group to plant sunflowers, a lot of sunflowers, in the tsunami-affected area near the Sendai airport. Together with the local people, we planted sunflowers this year too. Many more sunflowers than last year. By August, we expect that you will be able to see a circle of sunflowers in full bloom near the runway of the Sendai airport. While planting sunflowers, many local survivors admired the competence and courageous rescue activities that American military personnel performed to restore the runway and helped many Japanese in the immediate aftermath of the devastating tsunami. They were all thankful to Americans. Thank you all. On the matter of international development, I have to recall the Colombo plan in 1954, which Japan participated. And that was the beginning of Japan's participation of international development cooperation. In other words, Japan's development assistance is as old as myself, as I was born in that year. Many things have changed since then. The Cold War was over, and information technology is changing all aspects of our life. I now rely on my iPad to make presentations. In the area of international development, new actors and new sources of financing are emerging. Substantial progress has been made on the Millennium Development Goals, but more work needs to be done. At the same time, emerging challenges such as climate change and growing inequality have risen on the global agenda, and we must find ways to tackle these issues. We also find ourselves having to address these development challenges against the backdrop of weak economic growth and budget constraints in our own countries. Well, today I would like to briefly touch upon where Japan's international cooperation is headed in the coming years, and then concentrate on where there are promising opportunities to work with our closest ally, the United States. As was introduced, I assumed the current position in April, and it's been 3 months. And since becoming president, many people have asked me, what is your vision for JICA? As a political scientist who has to deal with reality, it's a bit hard for me to come up with visions. I may be somewhat like a President Bush, the senior Bush. But then, I have been talking to our staff at JICA in colloquial Japanese, 元気の出る援助をしましょう, which literally means, let's do invigorating assistance. Whether invigorate is the right translation or not, I think Mike will correct me later. Invigorating who? Invigorating the people of the developing world and the Japanese. By invigorating the developing world, let us invigorate Japanese society too. That is my colloquial message to our staff and the people in Japan. But what would constitute 元気の出る援助 more conceptually? Actually, my academic translation of 元気の出る援助 into conceptual English is international cooperation efforts that facilitate inclusive and dynamic development, as schematically shown on the handout I hope you all have. In order to invigorate the people of the developing world, development cooperation should be inclusive. It should not forget about minorities. It should not allow gaps to expand. It should improve human security of the entire population. And in order to invigorate the people of the developing world, development cooperation should be dynamic. It should foster peace building. It should be helpful for reconstruction. But it should also be flexible and adaptable to different phases of development. Eventually, international development cooperation should build and expand better societies and prosperous markets. In addition, the process of inclusive and dynamic development, I believe, will enhance friendship between Japanese and the people of the developing world, and enhance scientific knowledge that should be useful to Japan, industry countries, as well as the developing world. In this context, I believe that there are many opportunities to work together with the US. The common agenda forged between President Clinton and Prime Minister Miyazawa in 1993 was a milestone. Over the next 2 decades, our joint efforts most prominently focused on combating infectious diseases such as HIV/AIDS and malaria, and increasing access to safe drinking water. However, in my view, I think that now is the time that U.S.-Japan cooperation on development is really beginning to blossom. From global health to food security to public-private partnerships, we are finding many opportunities to work together. On the global health front, both Japan and the United States released new strategies around the 2010 UN MDG Summit. The new strategies have a lot in common, namely our joint emphasis on fighting infectious diseases, improving maternal and child health, and strengthening health systems more broadly. So based on these shared goals and approaches, we are now coordinating both at the policy and operational levels in such countries like Ghana, Senegal, and Bangladesh to map out ways in which the US and Japan can complement each other's activities and achieve better results on the ground. Meanwhile, with the rising state of climate fluctuations and food price spikes, along with continuing global hunger, both Japan and the United States recognize that more needs to be done on food security. Here too, we have found complementarities. Japan's strength, I believe, lie in training agricultural workers, increasing agricultural productivity, and managing water resources. Meanwhile, the US has expertise in post-harvest processing and storage, increasing market access and promoting public-private partnerships. Based on these mutual strengths, we have signed an MOU with USAID to deepen our collaboration. And we are initially focusing on Tanzania, Ghana, Rwanda, and Senegal as countries to work together more closely. Public-private ownerships also represent a growing area for collaboration. When we talk about development assistance today, we cannot forget that the nature of resource flows to developing countries has dramatically changed. Private capital now accounts for more than 5 times the amount of ODA flows. Both the US and Japan have vibrant private sectors with innovative technologies and products that could have positive development impacts. So we have launched a series on consultation with USAID on opportunities for public-private partnerships. Our discussions are starting to bear fruit, in fact. In particular, we are considering establishing an Africa Water PPP fund with USAID's Development Credit Authority to expand access and attract private investment to Africa's water sector. Another example is in Ghana. JICA and USAID are working with a Japanese food company called Ajinomoto to produce, distribute, and expand sales of a nutritional supplement that is expected to improve nutritional outcomes for weaning children. While the US and Japan have ongoing productive partnership in these 3 fields, I think we can go even further. I see 5 challenges for deep engagement: China, Afghanistan, Myanmar, the Asia-Pacific region, and the post-MDGs agenda. First, China. Japan's development assistance in China dates back to 1979. Our assistance has ranged from large infrastructure to environmental protection projects. Several decades later, now we face a China that is no longer mainly an aid recipient, but an aid provider in its own right. In fact, in a high-level meeting between my predecessor, Madame Ogata, and Deputy Prime Minister Li Keqiang in 2009, Mr. Li stated, "Supporting the least developed countries is one of the most important challenges for China-Japan cooperation." In this context, JICA and the Export-Import Bank of China have held joint workshops for 4 times to exchange information and to build up a sense of mutual trust. Our workshops have covered a range of topics, including loan management and debt sustainability, environmental and social safeguard policies, and green growth. We know that the US has similarly reached out to China to explore development cooperation, particularly in the fields of agriculture, health, and human resources. In the future, I think Japan and the US should continue to engage emerging donors in order to improve mutual understanding, share best practices, and advance the global development agenda. Afghanistan is also a priority country for both the US and Japan. In fact, Japan has played a leading role as the second largest donor behind the US. Since 2001, Japan disbursed approximately $4 billion for assistance projects, including infrastructure improvement, agricultural and rural development, and basic human needs. Some tangible results include over 800 schools have been built, 10,000 teachers have been trained, over 3,000 police officers have been provided with literacy education and training, and the terminal building at Kabul International Airport was built. There are at this moment about 70 JICA staff, Japanese nationals, stationed in the country today, working hard to support its reconstruction. At the Tokyo Conference on Afghanistan that was held early this month, the government of Afghanistan committed to making efforts in the areas of security, peace process, governance, and economic independence. In response, the international community committed to providing $16 billion in assistance through 2015 to support the country. However, looking ahead, uncertain and difficult political and security factors still remain. The 2014 presidential election and the scheduled withdrawal of ISAF at the end of 2014 will be an important moment. As we proceed, we need to bear in mind Afghanistan's long history as well as the fragility of the state building process. The international community, including US and Japan, should move ahead with seamless assistance in terms of geography and time. And we must consider our assistance efforts from both a short-term and a mid to long-term perspective. We must also think carefully about how to support Afghanistan's neighbors to ensure regional stability. While also fragile, Myanmar poses a different set of challenges for the US and Japan and the broader development community. While many countries impose economic sanctions and suspend their aid to the government of Myanmar due to the emergence of the military regime in the late 80s, Japan continued to provide development cooperation confined to addressing basic human needs. With the recent dramatic shifts in political reforms in Myanmar, we are now in a position to utilize the working relationships that we maintained during the last decades. Responding to recent political reforms in Myanmar, Japan has expanded the scope of its assistance to that country. This April, Prime Minister Noda met with President Thein Sein in Tokyo and announced 3 points. First, the improvement of Japan's assistance for the improvement of people's livelihoods, including assistance for ethnic minorities and the extreme poor, as well as agricultural and rural development. 2, capacity building and institutional development to sustain economy and society, including assistance for democracy promotion. And 3, development of infrastructure and related systems necessary for sustainable economic development. While there is significant momentum toward reform, remaining challenges in Myanmar are wide-ranging and complicated. Politically, reconciliation with ethnic minorities is critical. Economic transformation, especially fiscal reform, is very much needed to move towards a market economy. And socially, poverty reduction remains the highest national priority. Capacity in the government also remains extremely weak to implement all the changes that are required. Addressing this myriad of challenges will require extensive donor coordination. Going forward, I hope that the US and Japan, along with other bilateral donors as well as international organizations, will be able to work out an effective division of labor in coordination with the government of Myanmar. More broadly, in the Asia-Pacific region, the US and Japan share many common interests. While positive momentum for development does exist in Asia, there are still many risks which could undermine security and development achievements, such as transnational crimes and conflict over natural resources. After the US-Japan Security Consultative Committee, the so-called the 2+2 meeting this April, the US and Japan confirmed the importance of collaborating with each other to promote peace, stability, and prosperity in the Asia-Pacific. Japan, for its part, plans to make more strategic use of ODA to secure safety in the region. In fact, Japan has already contributed to mitigating risk by providing technical assistance and training for coast guards and national police in various countries. Through effective dialogue within this framework, I would like to see more US-Japan partnership programs in the future and promote regional development and stability. The last area where I see opportunity for greater dialogue and cooperation is on the framework for the post-MDGs agenda. We find the world today a changed place from 2000. Emerging global issues such as climate change, food security, the global economic crisis, and natural disasters require more attention to build resilience. Domestic and regional income disparities triggered the Arab Spring and also salient in East Asia, underscore the need for inclusive development. Looking beyond 2015, we need to set goals and develop mechanisms where a more diverse range of actors can make coordinated contribution to global development. While the US and Japan have been making joint efforts on eradicating infectious diseases and food security, let us take another step forward to broaden the agenda, to include more players and to take leadership in the quest for solutions. The US-Japan partnership has often been acknowledged as a public good for the long-term stability and prosperity of the Asia-Pacific region and international community at large. And it has made significant contribution to tackling global issues. With the emergence of new economic centers, some people may insist that US and Japan's power in international politics and economy is on the decline. However, it should be noted that the US-Japan relationship is more mature today than in the early 1990s, and it is still evolving. Support for the bilateral alliance in both countries has never been stronger. The two countries are the leaders in many scientific innovations. Although economic uncertainties are surrounding us, let me reaffirm that international development cooperation is a crucial tool for both countries to contribute to the peace and prosperity of the international community. We should not be inward looking. To the contrary, I believe that responding to global challenges will ultimately energize both countries. That is Genki no Deru Enjo. As a long-time believer in a strong US-Japan alliance, and in my current capacity as president of JICA, I will strive to upgrade the level of cooperation between Washington and Tokyo. By working more closely together, I firmly believe that we can accelerate progress on today's global challenges to create a better future for all. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Tanaka-sensei, I have to say, first of all, I have to say Tanaka-sensei because I'm an academic, and for any academic involved in Asian studies, President Tanaka is a Dai Senpai, a real teacher, mentor to many of us. So I'm going to call you sensei instead of president, because that's how I've known you for many years. I want to ask you a personal question first, just to make you a little nervous. But I'm curious, you know, moving from Tokyo University, where you had management responsibilities, you were a dean and a vice president, what surprised you most at JICA?
Well, well,
Good or bad?
I'm not sure if there are people involved in the University of Tokyo. I came from the university. I found in JICA the real organization that can work under the direction of the president. I was a vice president of a big university, which is a good experience for me to train myself to be patient. But then I realized that when I was at the university, you know, no matter what you said, how silly things that I, you know, say, that doesn't pose any danger because no one listens. But then I have to be careful in a real organization. If I say stupid things, then JICA staff might implement them.
They're all taking careful notes. So it really is striking how the U.S., Japan common agenda or common purpose on development assistance has matured, as you said. You and I both remember in the early 90s when there were these debates at the World Bank over the Washington Consensus versus some alternative that people argued was championed by Tokyo. And over the last 7 or 8 years, in my own experience in government and following these things, I would say that among the G20, even the G7, no countries are closer on development issues than the U.S. and Japan, and that includes our special relationship, Britain. So we have come a long way. I wanted to ask you about China a little further. Are we in a philosophical confrontation with China between two development models, the so-called Beijing Consensus and whatever we are, the Washington Consensus? Or is this a lot of noise, sort of like what we saw between the U.S. and Japan in the 90s?
Well, I think, as you know, you just mentioned that in the 1980s, when we studied seriously about U.S.-Japan economic frictions, we used to talk a lot about two divergent models: Japanese model, development state model, and U.S. and other regulatory state models. Still, I think there are some elements of, you know, truth to that different characterizations. But I think, in retrospect, the divergence between the Japanese models and the American models have been rather exaggerated. And in that sense, we need to caution ourselves about the divergence between the so-called Washington Consensus as opposed to Beijing Consensus. In my understanding, our Chinese friends are also in search of their development models. I don't believe is a fixed Beijing model or a fixed authoritarian model that they would like to sell to the world. I think many Chinese friends that I have are really serious about debating what should be the best economic system, what should be the best political system for the China to continue its growth. So I think the worlds are all in search of better development models. Personally, I would like to see a lot more rule of law and respect of human rights in various attempts of various countries. But then I think we are all in search of better models. I think, and then in that respect, we should be proud that U.S. and Japan have been contributing a lot, particularly in the area of good governance, rule of law, and promotion of democracy.
So there can't be a battle between the Beijing consensus and the Washington consensus because there's no consensus in Beijing, and of course there really isn't in Washington. And I want to ask you about governance and democracy as well. That has not been a traditionally prominent part of Japan's donor assistance history. Certainly not compared with the U.S. or some European countries. And you mentioned it in your talk in the context of Burma or Myanmar. What do you see as Japan's role or niche in governance and democracy? Is it something Japan should do unique from its own experience? Is it something that would be coordinated with the U.S. or third countries? How do you see the future of governance and democracy in your portfolio?
Well, although we all agree that good governance, democracies, rule of laws are goals, and but then we are not quite sure what would be the best way to achieve these goals. And then, as Mike said, traditionally Japan has been fairly cautious in expressing our values of good governance, democracy, rule of law, when it comes to connecting that to the actual implementation of international development cooperation. But then I think among the Japanese who have been involved in international development cooperation, the importance of these values have always been obvious. Probably one characteristic of Japanese is to make contribution in building foundations on which good governance can flourish. One area I think Japan has been doing, or JICA has been doing, and which I think is quite productive, is JICA's efforts to help Cambodia to write civil code and help Vietnam to prepare civil code as well as other laws related to constitution. These efforts of providing legal system may not be able to bring about democracy instantly, but I think these should be the basis on which the real rule of law should flourish. And then in terms of Myanmar, I believe we have to be cautious about the future development, but then the current development in Myanmar should be encouraged by the coordinated efforts of the international community. I am not sure about the efficacy of the negative sanctions in order to promote good governance or rule of law. Sometimes it may work, sometimes it may not. But at the time when positive trends are emerging, I think we should not refrain from extending positive measures.
Let me ask a follow-up on that. I'm going to Naypyidaw, Rangoon myself next month with Ernie Bauer and other colleagues from CSIS, and we'll be interested to see how this looks on the ground. But we, the U.S. now, and most of the democracies of the world have pretty much moved forward. There's not much left in terms of brakes. It's all gas pedal now, and there is some merit to that. But one of the problems is going to be what you might call carpetbagging, just this flood of NGOs and corporations. And so is it really, how are we going to coordinate approaches when the doors are now open in a way where everyone, including CSIS, is rushing in? How do you do that mechanically? Isn't it almost too late in a way?
Well, I realize this is potentially a very big challenge. Well, on the one hand, it is natural to expect that everyone, in good mind, they try to help accelerate democracies and good governance. But on the other hand, there are dangers of a lack of coordination or fragmentations of various efforts. And then also, I think one thing that we need to really take into consideration is the capacity of the government of Myanmar to absorb all the efforts. And then potential danger is this, the fact that the government of a recipient country cannot absorb the all good-willing hands might create sort of a disappointment in the latter stages. I think the process of helping recipient countries to move ahead with democracy, we need to have patient efforts, persistent efforts. And so we need really efforts of coordination. But then certainly there are no ready-made efforts of coordination. And I think for that things, it is important for such significant donors like the United States or Japan should start efforts of coordination in earlier months rather than later.
Thank you. Let me open it up. If you could raise your hand, I'll get a microphone in your direction, and please identify yourself. Yes, sir. Up front. Do we have our microphone troop? Yeah.
I'm Francis Skrobashevsky. I'm a director of the Afghan-American Chamber of Commerce and also a director of the U.S.-Polish Trade Council in Silicon Valley. I want to thank you for all of your work and efforts in Afghanistan in particular. My question is, what we saw in Poland over the last 20 years, it was the private sector that drove the development of the Polish economy. And it was creating the opportunity for the entrepreneurs in Poland that gave that possibility. The Afghan-American Chamber of Commerce believes that the same can be done in Afghanistan. That is, there is a vibrant private sector there, and that private sector needs to be encouraged and developed. And what I'm curious about is, what are the initiatives? You gave a great presentation on your efforts in Afghanistan. What are the initiatives that are focused on private sector entrepreneurial development in Afghanistan? Thank you.
Well, this is a great area that the international community should pay attention to. I think how to encourage the private sector to flourish in Afghanistan. And JICA's previous attempts, in my understanding, has not been focused on that particular target. But what we have been doing and what we are going to do is going to be the basis on which the private sector initiative could flourish. One thing that we have been doing a lot is the Kabul's Metropolitan Development Project, including the creating a better water supply system. And of course, Afghanistan is a big country, and so what we can do is limited, but then in my understanding, creating the capital more friendly to private sector investment and private sector activity would be at least consistent with what you have just mentioned.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you very much for your most informative presentation. My name is Mindy Reiser. I'm a sociologist, and I've worked with U.S. government agencies in Central Asia and the Caucasus on training programs and evaluation programs. And my question is this. Secretary of State Clinton has been very concerned with women's issues and development programs that support women in various ways. And as you know, Melaine Verveer is the special ambassador she appointed to deal with women's issues. I'd like to know how you see integrating a focus on women, their health, their economic opportunities, their educational opportunities within the portfolio that you've just shared with us.
Well, thank you very much. How we should be effective in terms of encouraging the betterment of the conditions of women, I think is a very important a task that we need to develop. And when we talk about the necessity of inclusive growth, I think one of the most important categories of those we would like to reach out is the women. But then, in addition to women, recently I attended a brown bag lunch organized by the JICA Research Institute, which talked about the importance of include handicapped and handicapped women. I think we need to also consider and then pay special attention to that. And so we certainly give importance to women, but then that could include those minorities or those who have generally been regarded as on the fringe of the society. I think we should eradicate these discrimination.
The next question I had was over here. Right. Keep going. Thanks.
I am Dr. Nisar Chaudhry. Is the voice okay? With Pakistan American League. My question is relating to Afghanistan. You had mentioned that you are had been the second biggest donor and contributor. In the case of that region, the stability of Afghanistan and Pakistan, it has become truly interdependent. And do you have any major projects or partnership with USA in case of Pakistan also? And the money you invest and the money you give, do you also have a mechanism in place that monitors and directly monitors how it is invested and spent or consumed to eradicate or minimize corruption out of it?
Well, we consider our relations with Pakistan very important. Well, as I said, as a neighbor of Afghanistan, but then also on its own. And my staff may be able to respond to you in more detail about what we have done. But one interesting project that we have been doing in Pakistan is the efforts of eradication of polio, and that is I think quite innovative idea of having partnership with Gates Foundation. We agreed to extend concessional loans to the government of Pakistan, and to the extent that the efforts of eradication works, to the extent that their success, the Gates Foundation was kind enough to agree to repay our concessional loans. And so I think that's a quite interesting efforts of cooperation with Americans and private sector philanthropic organizations with JICA.
Let me call him Dan Rundy, who's our intellectual lead here at CSIS on development issues.
Thank you very much. I'm Dan Rundy. I co-direct the U.S. Leadership and Development Project here at CSIS. It's a great honor to have you, Dr. Tanaka. Thank you so much for coming. My question is the political will to support official development assistance in Japan. Certainly here in the United States, I think the next several years are going to be years of incredible pressure on the official development assistance. Many countries in Europe, you're seeing the beginnings of a downturn. I think the UK is an outlier, and maybe Australia is an outlier. But if I look at the other OECD countries, I think what we've been saying here is that the 10-year bull market on official development assistance of the tripling of ODA is over. And I'd be curious about what sort of political pressures you're under in Japan on the one hand, and what do you think the prospects are, but also what is the argument that you're making, the political argument that you're making to sustain official development assistance, and how is that changing, if at all? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I regard the efforts of persuasion to the public one of the most important work that I need to do. Over the last 10 years or so, during the time when the Japanese considered its economy to be stagnant, regard the 10 years as the lost decade. The support to official development assistance had declined, particularly in the first 5 years of the first decade of the 21st century. And it seemed that it bottomed out, and gradually the support rate came back. But last year we had this big natural disaster, and there emerged a voice that while we need a lot of people in Japan in need of reconstruction, all the help we need, how much should we really to spend for the assistance abroad? So I think that's general so conditions in which I need to work to persuade others, at the public. And that's part of the reason that I coined the word Genki no Deru Enjo, assistance to invigorate both the developing world as well as Japan. I try to persuade that it is not simply for the betterment of the rest of the world, although to some extent indirectly, by bettering the world, we can better the Japanese society. And then in fact, quite a number of Japanese were very much impressed by the sympathy and support given to Japan in the immediate aftermath of the East Japan Great Earthquake. A village in Afghanistan collected money to send to give the Japanese village. Group of people in Rwanda collected money to give Japan to reconstruct the efforts. And in many cases, virtually all developing countries, we received aid for Japan. This, I think, gave a lot of appreciation on the part of the Japanese. And so when we conducted the survey in Japan, how much we should spend for the official development assistance around Japan last year, the response from the areas affected by the tsunami showed the highest in support of official development assistance. That, I think, is a very positive trend.
Excellent. Powerful, powerful story. The polls you've seen, I'm sure, in the past decade about which countries in the world are respected, BBC, Samsung Research Institute, on soft power and so forth. You probably know, Sensei, that Japan's always in the top three. And then after March 11th, Japan actually went up in many of these surveys because of these kinds of demonstrable sources of appreciation of Japan. Yes, sir. Right.
Hello, my name is is Reese Scott. I will soon be a graduate student at Oxford University at the Nissan Institute, where Dr. Tanaka, or Tanaka-sensei, I should say, used to be a faculty member.
Yeah.
My question actually relates to Japan's ranking on the Commitment to Development Index, which the Center for Global Development put out. I actually have 2 copies here, one in English, one in Japanese, for your reference. If someone would like to, I'll just leave it right here. Of course. Anyway,
I think he has it memorized.
The Center for Global Development ranks Japan 21 out of 22 richest countries in terms of policies that benefit developing countries, and in light of that, I was wondering what concrete steps Japan would take to improve its position on the index, and particularly with respect to tariffs, because that's what really hurts Japan in the index is agricultural tariffs. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I regret to say that I'm not quite familiar with that index, and so it's a bit hard for me to make proper responses. And in terms of Japan's efforts of development assistance, or also Japan's attitude internationally, I think Japan has always been criticized for the high tariff on agriculture, rice production, and all this. It's I think the fact that it is the source of contention, and then it is these are, as you may easily understand, it's all sources of domestic debate, very highly sensitive issues, and so as somebody who is in charge of implementing agencies, it's very hard to take a stand on these domestic issues. But I personally believe that Japan should become a more open society and willing to make their system more compatible with the rest of the world, particularly with the developing world. And then I, as an implementing, as a head of an implementing agency, I would like to expand and improve Japan's assistance qualitatively and quantitatively too.
For those not familiar with the index, the criticism is not of JICA, it's of JA, Japan Agriculture, implicitly the closed agricultural market in Japan, which is intensely debated in the context of TPP and trade and other things, and we'll see what happens. But quickly, if I could ask about aid effectiveness, which is a hot topic which you didn't touch on. My wife is in this field. She's an expert on monitoring and evaluation, or interested in it, and I'm constantly being monitored and evaluated at home. I don't know how it works in the field. I get these quantitative indicators every week, generally going from yellow to red. But as you look at JICA as a political scientist, and you as a political scientist had skill not just with political philosophy, but also quantitative methods, do you see room or new ways to improve aid effectiveness through monitoring and evaluation and follow-up work and so forth?
I believe that it is important for the community of development cooperation to pay a lot more attention to the result. It is important to talk about the quantities of aid, the inputs that you give to the development assistance. That's very important. But then I think what eventually will bring about international development or development is the result. How you translate input into result is the important. And so and then in this respect, I have found, after assuming the position that our organization, JICA, has been fairly faithfully conducting evaluation of the projects that we have done. And and then using a lot of numerical indicators that are fairly common with the other development assistance community in the world, and some of them evaluated as good, some of them fair, and I think after reading the evaluations, it is good that our review produced both good and bad things. I think it is natural that some of these may not work. But these efforts will eventually will make our efforts better.
Yes, Chuck. The microphone. Yeah.
Chuck Onenson, Peace Wins America. I'd like to ask you about your loan program that you acquired from JBIC. I think it's one of your best programs in ODA. I regret that USAID did away with our loan program. I'd like to ask, are there targets for your loan program? Do you plan to expand your loan program? Much of Asia, including China, Vietnam, Indonesia, almost all of the Asian countries have greatly benefited, not only by the infrastructure that you built, but by the rigorous financial requirements that you imposed upon those countries. So every time I hear of ODA from Japan, I really want to praise your loan program. But I'd like to know if you want to expand that, and how soon can you move this toward Africa with maybe less stringent requirements, but also focusing on the necessary infrastructure?
Well, thank you very much. The one, I think, challenge that I face now is how to incorporate the loans program with the other schemes of development, technical cooperation and grants. And then also there are some practical issues confronting JICA with respect to concessional loans. That's as I think I appreciate your comments, and I feel very good about that. But sometimes there have been criticism that it takes too much time for Japan to decide on concessional loans, and the requirements appear to be too rigorous for developing countries, and then as a result, over the last few years, the amount of disbursement has not increased too much, and but we would like to increase the disbursement in the coming years, not just in Asia or Southeast Asia and South Asia, but other parts of the world, particularly in Africa. We have to be careful because we need to discriminate how best to use grant aid and concessional loans on what projects. I think these should be suited to the local conditions of recipient countries. But then there are quite a number of hopeful potential projects that we could utilize concessional loans to Africa. During the time of tenure of my predecessor, Madam Ogata, Japan's assistance to Africa, particularly in grant and technical cooperation, increased, more than doubled. And so the next thing that we need to consider is to increase concessional loans to Africa. Africa has a lot of projects that are suited for concessional loans. Only thing that we have to take into consideration is this the governance of recipient countries and also financial soundness that could accept loans.
Here, second row.
My name is Sanjin Choi and Langham Partners. Could I follow up your comment in A, dealing with Japan and China infrastructure issues, and B, food security issues? You mentioned China become a recipient to aid donor, and China is beginning to buy Japanese government funds, and Japanese yen appreciate. Perhaps China become a competitor at an infrastructure project, especially in Africa and Latin America. I'd be interested in your views. And second, food security issues. I noticed Marubeni has acquired Gravel, which is large U.S. grain exporter. Would I possibly see there is increasing partnership between public and private sector in food security? Thank you.
Thank you very much. China is now a great donor. Last week, China held a big conference on Africa, and President Hu Jintao declared to extend huge amount of loans for African development. I personally do not regard this as a competition. Africa really needs a lot of efforts of cooperation. And if Africa attracts good loans from China, that is going to be very good. I understand that JICA alone is not able to satisfy all the needs that Africa has. And so we would welcome the Chinese willingness to join the efforts of international community to encourage the development of Africa. I think as the last meeting at Busan indicated, that was made with these OECD efforts, but there are, I think, increasing tendency for the Chinese officials to participate in the development assistance. And so I think, as I made in my presentation, that we should take advantage of these to increase our discussion with our Chinese counterparts to really make our joint efforts more productive and to be to the benefit of the recipient countries, particularly in Africa. And then the second is food security. Food security is very important, and I consider the possibility of working closely with the private sector a very productive way to achieve food security. And so in that sense, again, we would like to pursue more efforts like the one that you just mentioned.
I'm going to bundle the last two questions and then we'll wrap up. So I have one gentleman here, and I've kind of been neglecting the back. Let me get way back there with the hand up. So why don't we get these two questions, you can do them together. Please.
Yes. Okay. My name is Fred Berger with the Lewis Berger Group. When I run into JICA volunteers in the field, I'm uniformly impressed with their quality, their knowledge, and their ability to integrate into the cultures they're in. But when I meet with consulting firms or I meet with JICA itself, I see very, very little population returning from the JICA volunteer group into the continuing sector, if you will, of development assistance. I wonder if there's going to be an evolution in the JICA volunteers program that will incorporate more of them.
Okay, and then one more back here.
My name's Larry Chergino. I'm a private consultant. My issue is probably not the popular one, but what is JICA's perspective on how to ameliorate corruption in the developmental community's work, in ameliorating in societies that you're trying to help, the cultural aspects, the difficulties there?
Ameliorating corruption in the recipient country. So what do you do about corruption in a country that's receiving your loans or grant aid?
Well, firstly, well, I quite grateful for your appreciation of JICA volunteers. I think as one of the programs that we conduct, the volunteers program is particularly useful for me to persuade the public in support of development cooperation. Because we could show to the public that JICA volunteers who experienced 2 years of their life in various parts of the world are in fact bringing back to Japan the real capability that could invigorate the society. And in fact, in the efforts of reconstruction or in the immediate aftermath of this Tohoku disaster, many of our volunteers actually joined forces to go to Tohoku to develop and make reconstruction efforts more in a much better and quicker manner. And your impression that although the volunteers are good, there may be some tendency that JICA itself has not hired those people. Actually, we hire many JICA volunteers, and then now I think in addition to JICA, we feel that the JICA volunteers can have many more places in the world. In the various segments of Japanese society. Leading trading companies now say that JICA volunteers are great resources for their global marketing. And so I think that's the case. And then about corruption, we do not tolerate corruption. When corruption emerges and becomes apparent, we are not able to continue that project.
I'm going to turn it over to our President, John Hamre, for the closing benediction. Let me say while he's heading up to the microphone how delighted I am, Sensei, to see you in this role and to say your self-effacing humor aside, you clearly do have a vision for JICA, and it's an excellent one that's compelling for a foreign audience and I'm certain for a domestic audience. So thank you indeed.
I'll wrap up very quickly. First, let me say thank you to all of you for coming. I'm delighted you're here, and I'm very happy to see such a strong turnout to be here for Tanaka Sensei's presentation. I must apologize to Tanaka Sensei. I'm the chairman of the Defense Policy Board, and the secretary called kind of a pop-up meeting which I had to attend, and I'm struck by the difference in these meetings. I come here, and of course what comes across in your speech and what came across in your dialogue with the audience is the spirit of confidence and hope. And that's what really is going to move this world. This is what we're really short of right now. We're not short of money, we're not short of human talent, we're short of confidence. And you've given us that today in the way you've addressed these themes. Too much of the development agenda in this country for the last 10 years has been grounded in fear. And I think it needs to be shifted. It needs to be shifted to be grounded in hope and optimism and confidence, and you've certainly expressed that today. That's the purpose of this Chevron Forum that we have. If we can find a development agenda where the goal is to build better societies, healthier communities, healthier people, everyone can embrace that agenda. And I think that you're charting that way. We are grateful for the work you're doing. We know that your leadership is going to make a huge difference. Would you all please congratulate him with your applause?